In this video, I'm going to show you an efficient and professional workflow for the creation of optimized 3D game assets using Blender, Substance Painter, and Unreal Engine. I found there weren't many clear end-to-end guides covering the whole process, so I made this one. So here's the final result in Unreal. This is a model composed of a chair and a pillow, but since it's authored as one object, it only requires a single draw call on the GPU, which is ideal for performance. And then even though it uses two materials, if we check the material graph, you can see we're only working with 3 texture maps, since we're using packed UVs and a vertex color workflow just like AAA Studios would do. And this is also using a high to low poly workflow, meaning I modeled a high detailed version first, and then bake that detail into the texture maps for the low poly in-game mesh. This gives us both maximum visual fidelity and optimal performance. So I'm going to run you through the whole pipeline, starting in Blender, then into Substance Painter for baking and texturing, and finally setting it up in Unreal. If you're using Unity instead, the exact same workflow applies. We'll just hook things up a bit differently at the end. Let's get started modeling in Blender. Just come in and delete everything, and then add a cube. And go into edit mode and hit 3 for face selection, select these two faces and delete them. Then subdivide the cube and grab these two faces and then with G and move them down on the Z-axis, and then hit 2 for edge selection mode. Grab these edges and move them back on the Y-axis. And then head back to object mode and create a subdivision surface modifier, making it level 2, and then add a solidify modifier, giving it a thickness of 16 centimeters. And then apply both of them and come back to edit mode and add a loop cut just here and scale it up. And then we'll select these edges. And bevel them, Control B, and then scroll the mouse wheel to add a couple of loop cuts. And then keeping those selected, head back to object mode and add another subdivision surface modifier, level 2 again, and then apply that. And then go to sculpt mode and select the cloth filter, making it inflate type. And then under face sets, select face sets from edit mode selection, and click in use face sets, and then just inflate the chair. The way that you like. And then we'll come back to object mode and right click and shade smooth. And then under the view for overlays drop down, make sure you enable statistics so you can see how many tries you're using for your objects. This is the high poly mesh for the chair. So we're done with that now, let's just hide it. Now let's work on the pillow. We'll hit Shift A to add a plane, go to edit mode, right click, subdivide 20 times, and then extrude up slightly and add a loop cut around the edge and scale out a little bit, and then come over to the physics tab and add a clock modifier, giving it a pressure of 3, and then under field weights disable gravity, and then head over to object mode and run the physics simulation. And you can pause on a frame that you like your pillow. I'll just use this, and then come back to the modifiers tab, add a subdivision surface modifier level 2 and apply both of those, and then head back to edit mode, alt left click to grab the loop cut and Control B to bevel, and then we'll just remove that inner loop cut, select this, and alt E to extrude faces along normals and just extrude inwards slightly to add the zipper line. Then head back to object mode, select and shade smooth, and then bring back the chair. You can see it's far too large, so we'll just scale down the pillow. And rotate it and translate it so it fits properly on the chair. Just try to make sure you don't have any intersecting geometry. Since that can cause some shading issues. And I'll just check my normals. That looks good. And make sure you Control A on the pillow and apply all transforms. And then we can highlight all of the objects and press Control J to join them. And this is our high poly mesh, so we'll rename this to chair underscore high. And then right click duplicate objects to get our low poly mesh, and we'll rename this to chair underscore low. And make sure you use this naming convention because Substance Painter will reference it. So on our low poly mesh, we'll add a decimate modifier to reduce the geometry. We'll set the ratio to 0.05. So now this has 3,000 polygons, 3,000 triangles, and this has 60,000 triangles. So it's only 5% as many triangles on this model. And we're going to bake most of the details from this model into the low poly mesh, so we can retain most of the detail, but only use 5% as many triangles. So on our low poly mesh, come over to UV editing and highlight everything. Now, make sure you apply the decimate modifier before you try to do this. So once you've selected your low poly mesh, and hit U, and then we'll just use Smart UV Project to unwrap the UVs. And then just average the islands and pack them together. And now we're almost done. Last thing we need to do is apply the vertex colors. So you go to edit mode and go to vertex selection mode and select the pillow by just clicking on the vertex and hit L to select the whole object, and come over to vertex paint mode and select the color. You use red and make sure you click vertex selection up here, and then under paint you hit set vertex colors, and then you can come back to edit mode and select the other objects and select a different color and set those vertex colors. And now we have the vertex colors on the mesh. So Substance Painter is going to use that as a mask to apply to different materials. And the last thing we need to do is move the low poly mesh back onto the same location as the high poly mesh. And you'll notice some artifacting because the decimate modifier shifted the geometry around a little bit. So what you want to do is just kind of grab the low poly mesh and move it around a little bit. Until you get a better overlap. So Substance doesn't have too many difficulties when we're baking. That should be okay. And now we'll just export those. Of course, make sure you apply all transforms on both meshes. And then select your high poly mesh and go File, Export, and in whichever folder you want your exports to live, you'll just want to rename this like chair underscore high.fbx, and make sure you select these settings. I have a preset for Unreal, but we just make sure to limit to selected objects of mesh type, and then Unreal uses forward on the x-axis and up on the z-axis. And under geometry, we'll triangulate the faces, select smoothing information for the faces, otherwise Unreal complains, and then set vertex colors to sRGB, which is default. I've already used this name, so I'll just call this c underscore high.fbx. And then selecting your low poly mesh, go to File, Export FBX, c underscore low.fbx, and we'll reuse the same settings. And that's it for Blender. Now we'll jump over to Substance Painter. Once you've opened Substance Painter, you just drag in your low poly mesh And on the import dialog, we'll just set document resolution to 4K and keep the input normal map format as OpenGL since the Blender import. And this is our low poly mesh. And if we come over to texture set settings and bake mesh maps, we'll set the output textures to 4K as well and disable IDs for now because we're going to bake them from the low poly mesh. And under high poly parameters, we'll just reference our high poly mesh. And you see we've got a bit of red here. So you can either increase the cage distance, or you can try out the new AI cage, which actually works really well. I'm going to use that. And then just hit bake. And once that's finished, you'll just disable all of the maps and enable ID. And then check use low poly mesh as high poly mesh and come over to the ID section and change the color source to vertex colors and bake the vertex colors in. And you see we've got a little artifact in here. If you want to get it perfect, you'll have to play around with your overlap in Blender and with the cage settings. But we can now very easily apply some smart materials. All you have to do is hold down Control and drag on to whichever part of the mesh you want to apply. And I'm actually going to use this material for the pillow and this one for the chair. And then I'm going to change the color here like this. And we'll just use that. You can see there's no artifacting around the backs and the sides. Once you're happy with your textures, you simply go File, Export Textures, and then I'll change the output template to Unreal Engine Packed, and then in the Output Templates tab, I will come over here to the Unreal preset, and I'm just going to add T underscore as a prefix to these, follow the Unreal Engine naming convention. And then just simply hit export. And it will put your texture maps into this directory. And now we'll just switch over to Unreal Engine. So in Unreal, open up your content drawer, and wherever you keep your custom meshes, we'll just add a new folder. And then drag in your low poly mesh. And make sure you disable recompute normals and recompute tangents because we want to use the information that's embedded in the FBX file. Apart from that, you can just select import. And I'll just rename this to SM. Yeah, demo. And we'll create a material. M underscore chair mat. And then make sure you assign this material to the object. And then just drag in your textures. And we'll just tweak these a bit. So highlight them, right click, asset actions, edit selection property matrix, and we'll disable virtual textures because it can cause some issues unless you need to be using virtual textures. And then the occlusion roughness metallic map should not be sRGB. The only map that should be sRGB is your base color albedo and your emission map if you're using one of those. Once you've done that, you can open your material graph and just drag in your textures. and we'll link up the albedo map to the base color, link up the normal map to the normal, and your packed ORM map. The red channel is ambient occlusion, the green channel is roughness, and the blue channel is metallic. And if you want to preview what that looks like, you can just open your content drawer, highlight your static mesh, and click this icon to get a preview. And to place it in the world, just come back to level, drag it in and rotate it as you would like. And that's how it looks in Engine. Hopefully this demonstration was useful. If you'd like to see more videos similar to this one, feel free to subscribe. Cheers.